So since Kalyan translates so much into English, maybe it's appropriate to have one English speaker for the evening. So I have known Kalyan for about 10 years now, as a dear friend, as a writer, and of course as a translator. And I think he's partly to blame for the fact that now I have started translating as well. And that phrase they use these days, normalize. I think knowing a translator in close proximity for this time has normalized translation and the act of translation for me. But today I intend to say a few things about being a reader of literature, a reader of literature and translation, and very specifically a reader of Kalyan's work. So I was thinking the other day about what I've read in Tamil. I don't read Tamil, so I read it through English. And I found that probably 75 to 80% of Tamil literary works that I've read have all been through the translation of Kalyan Raman. And so this is, it holds a unique place for me because it has given me many riches, I think. So after I met him, I crossed the road. We used to meet in Koshi, this cafe in Bangalore. I crossed the road to this premier bookstall and I got this Ashokamitran translation, a 1998 edition. And I took it home and I began to read it. The first story in this collection is called Tiger Artist in English. And I began to read it and very quickly it blew me away. So I'm going to read a short passage from this. So as many of you might know, there is a character called Kadir who is thin, meek, short, desperate man who's looking for a bit role in a film, who comes to this film studio, and there are these three men who have not been working very hard, let us say. I mean, they work in spurts, and they give bit roles and they're writers and so on. So he's very ingratiating and they are dismissive, and finally he decides to give them a demo of what he can do. He took out a tiger head from somewhere. Only then did we realize that he had brought a cloth bag with him. In a second he had pulled it over his face like a mask. He tugged it at the chin for a tight fit. He transformed into a tiger. His own eyes shone through darkly. He threw darting glances around the room for a second or two. "Besh," said Sharma appreciatively. We stared at him, transfixed by his new incarnation. He raised his arms above his head and relaxed the muscles of his body. Then he brought his hands down to the floor to stand like a four-legged animal, turned his head from side to side, his look full of panther-like menace. "Besh," said Sharma again. He raised the middle of his back high like a cat, twisted his entire body and shook himself. Then he opened his maw. We were stunned. We had never before heard such a terrifying roar in our lives. He roared once more and then shook his hindquarters this way and that. The next moment he leapt up onto the empty chair in the room and crouched on its narrow seat, all his four paws drawn in. The chair shook noisily. I cried out, "Ayo!" He pounced over to my desk, landing nimbly on his four limbs. Before you could even blink, he had leapt up onto Sharma's table. Many papers, books, and a packet of beetle preparation were strewn haphazardly on the desk. His paws did not touch anything at all, not even slightly. He crouched once again on the table, glowered at its owner, and let out a blood-curdling roar. From the table, he leapt towards the ceiling. All of us shouted in sheer terror. So this is a dramatic scene, but in the very next page, he is falling at the feet of this character, Sharma, asking him for a small role, weeping, and so on. So there is an obvious irony here and so on. But also there is something very subtle being set up in the story. Of course, we all know that Ashokamitran is a great short story writer. So right at the beginning, their idle chat feeds back onto what happens later, and what goes on in that one room also tells us something about what is going on in that society, what is happening outside in the city. It talks about class inequality, it talks about many, many things. And this is a masterfully written short story. But to have this made apparent in a translation is also a masterful feat of translation. It requires a translator to be sensitive to literature, to be sensitive to the nuances of the original, and to be sensitive to people and how you are going to take it across to another language. And I think the story is fortunate that it found Kalyan Raman as a translator, and the rest of the book as well is brilliant. In fact, there is a character, Manikam, who at one stage has caught a bad case of piety because he's deep in debt, and Kalyan's translation of the description, where he rolls his eyes up and lowers his eyelids, it is something that has become a part of my consciousness now. Every time I meet somebody who is a bit over pious, that scene flashes into mind. So a lot of this has stayed with me. And of course, I went on to read all the other Ashokamitran works in translation. More recently, I read Devi Bharati's work, Farewell Mahatma, in Kalyan's translation. I was able to access Perumal Murugan's short stories last year, again in Kalyan's translation. And there's a lot of poetry that I ended up reading, which I would never have encountered otherwise. I read Kutti Revati, I read Salma, I read Tamil Sri Lankan poets. I read N.D. Rajkumar, and these are not people I would have read as a matter of course if it hadn't been for Kalyan's translation. And more recently, I read two novels by Poomani, Vekkai and Piragu, which have been beautifully translated by Kalyan. I don't think they're released, or probably they'll be released soon at some point. But they're marvelous translations, and they talk about a world to which I have absolutely no access. And through these translations, I gain some sort of access to that world. So which brings me to this somewhat playful provocation that I encountered last year somewhere. I read something. It was in a question-answer format. The question was this: who was the greatest Russian writer of the 19th century? The answer was Constance Garnett. So she's the translator of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Chekhov. And if you ask this question in English, of course they were all very well known and considered great writers there. But when you ask the question in English, if the same person has taken all of them into English and then onward through that language, then it becomes an interesting way to think about it. And so I was thinking that, almost all the Tamil literature I've read has come through Kalyan. And when we've met, we've had discussions about Tamil literature occasionally. His essays on Poomani, on Perumal Murugan, even his introductory essays to the translations he has done, they're magnificent. I mean, this one is, I'm lost for words really. It's a brilliant introductory essay to this book. So I was thinking, if I were to playfully ask myself that same question in a personal context, who is the greatest contemporary Tamil writer? So, strictly personally, the answer would be N. Kalyan Raman. So, because all the Tamil literature I've accessed, or at least a large amount of it has been through him. But I also only say this half playfully, because the other half is really gratitude to Kalyan, of course, but also a sense of gratitude to the work that translators do in general. They translate not just texts, they translate entire worlds from, one language to another, from one a group with an allied consciousness to other groups and so on. For example, another of the books I read in Kalyan's translation was Vadivasal. And I think if more people had read that translation, there would have been less nonsense spoken about Jallikattu from the rest of India probably earlier this year. Sadly, I think it is not very easily available these days. But translators do us an incredible service, and they don't get enough recognition for it often. And it involves a great deal of good taste, it involves a great deal of sensitivity, it involves a great deal of hard work, and quite often this goes unrecognized. And it is very important to recognize good translations when they come along, especially in our country where we have so many languages which are constantly rubbing up against each other in ways good and bad. So I'm thrilled to hear that for the first time this award is being given to a translator, of course, not only for his translation, but with a large component of Kalyan's work being a translation. I hope that more translators will be rewarded similarly in future, and I look forward to many more translations from Kalyan and maybe some original work as well. I've been trying to talk him into writing an autobiography, which will be fascinating, knowing the stories he has in him. And thank you very much for giving me a chance to be here. Congratulations, Kalyan, once again.